Hello, and you're welcome to the polling station. It's Johnny Ward live from South France, and just to prove that I actually am in the South of France, here's a book. We're with William Kedjanyi and Neil Shanning, who's been losing/winning money on the cricket in the last couple of minutes, and it's appropriate enough that I'm in France going to discuss the French election. We still have a 1 to 20 shot, but those who hope that Macron mightn't get it for either political or betting reasons may have had a little bit of hope in the last week or so. And we'll also obviously talk about what's going on in Britain with Boris and Rishi Sunak. Let's start with you, William Kedjanyi. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Very well. Hope you're well there in the south of France. Lovely to have a bit of legitimacy to our French election coverage. So good job there.
Yeah, I'm going to talk to people. Unfortunately, I've just arrived, so I didn't press the flesh, so to speak, as to how good people feel about life in general here. And obviously, Neil, it's no surprise that Macron has gone out onto the streets, and people have basically been complaining to him about the cost of living and so on and so forth, which is something that I'm sure isn't going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, I saw a poll this afternoon. I mean, basically the last few polls, it's very stable. It doesn't really move. Macron, I think in the last 20 polls, he's been between 27 and 29%, and it's almost always 28 every single time. Mélenchon is in third, and he has been in the last, 3, 6, 9, in the last 10 polls, he's either been 15% or 15.5%. So that doesn't move. And Le Pen is either 20 or 21 in every single poll. So it does look like, it's just an obvious 1, 2, 3. The last two, I think the final two is basically, it's like 100 to 1 on Macron and 8 to 1 on Le Pen to be in the last two, with Mélenchon kind of 10 to 1 and Zemmour 14 to 1. I did see some polling today about which ways people would vote, in terms of their second preference. And, there was lots of people, if your guy doesn't get into or your lady doesn't get into the last two, which way do you go? And I noticed quite a lot of centrist people were getting quite upset with the Mélenchon supporters, a lot of whom were saying that they were l'abstain. They were not going to vote, basically, if Mélenchon didn't make the last two. And I know a lot of Macron supporters were sort of saying that effectively the Mélenchon fans would be helping the far right if they didn't turn out and hold their nose and vote for Macron, which is pretty much what happened in the French election 4 years ago. It's real déjà vu. From a betting point of view, it's hard to get very excited now. Even if you are excited enough to have a tri-cast and to go for Macron and Le Pen in that order in the last two, and Mélenchon to come third, it's still about a 4 to 1 on chance. So I don't know whether there's any great betting angle in it right now. I know Paul had a bet. He's not with us this week, but he found a bet. He was betting on the first round vote share for Le Pen, and he bet 20 to 25 at 6 to 4. It's gone odds on now. I don't know how much Paul had on it, but it's about 10 to 11 now. And he said he thought that was still quite a good bet. So I don't know. I have had a little look at that, but I can't say I've gone too mad.
Yeah, and William, obviously Macron's handling of the Ukraine has gone down well at home. Marine Le Pen has, I think, told reporters she's never felt closer to getting elected, but that she's still realistically she's an 8 to 1 chance or whatever she is. I think her kind of campaign has been more on the struggles of poor people more so than immigration this time, and obviously we're in midst of a massive crisis down the tracks in terms of the cost of living and so forth. But what can happen realistically between now and the election if you're going to be beating this 1 to 20 shot?
I think there will need to be something that goes badly wrong with Macron's campaign. He has had a bit of negative press recently with the McKinsey scandal. Long story short, very wealthy private contracts who've doubled in value over the last few years. That's been getting him some negative attention. But I think in reality, I still think it's something that he'll have to lose. Although that said, we are now in the sort of zone. If you take the lab poll, which came out very recently, I think it was yesterday, that Paul actually was referring to on this blog, is 52.5 to 47.5. That's not an impossible gap to usurp. And there is one thing that Macron and his allies have been very concerned about, and it's turnout. It's turnout amongst his supporters. It's complacency amongst his supporters.
Yeah.
And we're getting into that zone where he really is counting all his supporters to go to the polls first, and especially second time round, particularly if many Mélenchon supporters do abstain. That's his biggest danger, I think. And it's interesting to note, he's now having to do a bit more domestic campaigning. Yes, Ukraine is a big issue in France, but the cost of living is right up there with it. And Marine Le Pen has had a bit of a free run at it recently, particularly as Valérie Pécresse had COVID, and Eric Zemmour has had his various troubles of being too firebrand. So we are seeing a thinning of the herd, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, there's an election in the next week or so, I think, in Hungary as well, and Orbán is trying to deal with his own issues there. But like, Neil, what does a far-right candidate like Le Pen do in the sense of, there's as William says, there's a crisis in terms of cost of living, there's going to be an energy crisis. How exactly people think this is the government's fault at times, to me, is a little bit baffling. But somehow, Neil, put yourself in the shoes of a woman who's a right-wing candidate in the French election. What does she do to somehow twist the minds of voters that voting for her would actually be better off in this crisis?
Well, I think she just, I mean, the thing with this French election is, so first of all, the far right in France has a certain base level, and I think it's about 15% really. So that's kind of where they're at. It's a lot of sort of the Trumpist American type thing. There's a rural vote, which generally goes, quite far to the right, and there's an urban vote that is a lot more kind of split between the left and the centre. And in France, that's meant that the left party has been pushed out. But what we've ended up with in this election is three right-wing candidates. Now, Pécresse is, not really that far right. She's not far right. She's a right-wing candidate. The kind of a conservative party candidate, you might think of her. Although Macron is really also, he's more of a kind of David Cameron conservative, whereas Pécresse is more of a Boris Johnson conservative. But then you've got this guy Zemmour, and I mean he's an Enoch Powell. I mean, he's literally talking about 100,000 people whose parents weren't born here being, inverted commas, sent back. And that's obviously just kind of racist stuff coming out of his mouth. But Pécresse is polling around about 9%, 10%, 9% around that region, and Zemmour is polling about 10%. So for Le Pen, in answer to your question, all she's really got to do is to convince people that if you're on the right or the far right, she's the one to go for. So she just has to spend her time trying to persuade people that Zemmour can't win, and that his 10% need to make sure they go to her to make sure she gets into the last two. So I think she's done a pretty good job of doing that. And she had a bit of a bad time early in the campaign. There were 800,000 leaflets printed with her standing with Putin and him endorsing her, and they had to be pulped. I think she seems to have got over that, and she has a traditional base, and if she can add the Zemmour people to that, she'll definitely get in the last two, I think.
What's happened?
And then you just get the traditional French thing where people tend in French elections to rally round and oppose the far right. I'm afraid I think it is quite predictable and quite boring, and I think the tri-cast will probably come in at 1 to 4.
Okay. Well, briefly, William, what's happened to the Zemmour campaign? He was definitely shorter than this at one stage.
Yeah. He's just lost a lot of steam. Really, I think if it's possible, and again, some people disagree with me on this, it's possible that he's been too extreme and seen as too extreme, when in relation to him, there was somebody in Marine Le Pen who appears more reasonable and a more realistic option for that sort of space of voters. Things worth remembering, in quite a few of the cases where we've had populists elected, they've had only one opponent or one main opponent to face off against in a one-round election. I think it's much easier to go sort of crazy that sense.
Yeah. She seems to have sort of toned down the rhetoric a bit over the years, has she?
Yeah. And also, when you're going on the cost of living crisis, and there is a big cost of living crisis, people might be inclined to forget some of the terrible and awful things you said. So I think, if anything, he's been outmaneuvered by Marine Le Pen. Her focus on the cost of living crisis, whilst Macron has been dealing with issues on the European and world stage, has opened the door for herself. That would be my read of why the war's gone backwards, I think.
Yeah, and in fairness, so that just if you do check the website and you don't fancy backing the 1-20 on Macron, you can bet on finishing the final two. And if you think Zemmour is going to somehow rally, he's actually 11-1 with Marine Le Pen 1-12, and Mélenchon is 8. And then you can bet as well on Emmanuel Macron's first round vote share. 25-30 is 4-7 favourite. It's 11-4 bar, and you can also vote Marine Le Pen's first round vote share, which is more or less split, tips on pretty much each of two, between 15-20, 20-25. So there's definitely an angle here, William, somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. I think the vote share markets would be where I'll be looking. I can see Le Pen finishing fairly strongly. We're 5-6 on essentially 20-25%, being that vote share in the first round. I think that's fair. She's going in one direction, the others are going in a different one. It's possible that she might be picking off some voters who are considering Pécresse as well. Her campaign slid back. Mélenchon is having a really strong end to the campaign, but I don't really know where he's got to go in terms of voters.
He can definitely pick up voters from the Greens and the traditional socialist candidate.
Yeah,
he can, but that's a smaller
given that people, it's obvious to people that they're not going to be in the first two now. And some people might think, well, look, we've got a shot of Mélenchon being in the first two. Maybe we have to desert the person we actually really liked. I think also with his he's got a lot of anti-EU rhetoric. So he can come across as a kind of populist outsider. And, if you remember, there was a situation after UKIP collapsed in the UK after they getting the 4 million votes in the 2010 election. 2015 election. And it was very difficult to predict which way those votes would split in the 2017 election. A lot of people thought they would automatically all go Tory. But actually quite a lot of those people went Labour.
Yeah.
I think if people are anti-EU, you kind of assume that they'll be on the right. But of course, they're presented with a populist candidate who's on the left. So I think it's slightly hard to predict. But having said that, literally every single poll that you get with Mélenchon is always 15, 15, 15 and a half.
Yeah.
And it never seems to move.
That point you make as well, that's been an interesting one for Sinn Féin, who have been pretty inherently anti-EU for much of their life, but are obviously hard on the left, or seem to be. And William and I promise you that we will have that election special before what to me is the most fascinating Northern election for years, really, where Sinn Féin is likely to top the poll, but unionism is so fractured, it's kind of hard to know what's going to happen on that side. So a myriad of sort of markets there. Only one place to start here, though, and that's Neil Shanning. The Labour leader brands the Tories pathetic and promises to help people deal with spiralling inflation. Again, I'm not really sure how you can do that, but Keir Starmer today launched Labour's local elections push, Neil.
Yeah, and they've gone again with a strategy of talking about the cost of living crisis and saying that they've gone with a slogan of Labour will be on your side. And then they talk again about a new start and everything like that. Funnily enough, in 2019, Jeremy Corbyn went with a slogan of Labour will be on your side because 3 months before the election, it kept coming up they kept testing it in focus groups. And it was actually really popular, so they thought they'd go with it.
On your side.
Yeah, it's kind of a vacuous statement, though, isn't it? Because,
Everything is
like,
vacuous
whatever
in these things.
political party you are, of course,
Yeah.
you're going to say you're on the side of the voters.
I am not on your side.
Like,
who is going to say that? Seriously.
Yeah, it doesn't really mean anything. But yeah, they did try it under Corbyn in 2019. So I think it's kind of funny that that Starmer's people have decided to go with that when, you know, obviously they've spent the last 2 years talking about how they're completely different from Corbyn. But also the idea that leading in a local election campaign on national issues, essentially talking about the cost of living crisis, I don't think that really works. And actually, you should fight local elections on local issues. And a lot of people do. I mean, most people in all elections just vote on the party that they like in a tribal way. But in local elections, you know, you can get some funny results because of local situations, often in London to do with low traffic neighbourhoods, or, you know, in Brighton to do with bin collection or whatever. There's always something coming up like that. I don't know. I wouldn't, if I was advising them, I wouldn't have said you should really lead on national issues like that. I mean, at the end of the day, whoever you get as your councillor in a month's time, they're not going to be able to sort out the crisis of inflation or wages.
No, he can't dictate what the price of gas is, you know, or he or she. And, you know, it's funny, William, that Ireland has been, in terms of the democracy that we've had, a lot of national elections have actually been fought on local issues, which is conversely what Neil is saying there. But this is going to be an interesting set of local elections. We will have a special for that as well, where Labour obviously goes in with lots of impetus, but at the same time, I don't know, maybe Boris has rallied a bit since the nadir of a month ago.
Yeah, Johnson has rallied a bit since his nadir.
I actually saw him speaking quite a lot of sense about offshore wind and nuclear power in the paper today.
Yes. I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to follow, because in terms of the change needed to implement to do something like increase our energy self-dependency, or to get close to like net zero or something, there are things you can do now for sure, but in reality that change is structural and has to move across different governments, right? For example, nuclear power and the move away from nuclear power, it wasn't just across one government here or Germany, etc. Took place across multiple. As far as local elections go, I think this is a continuation of what I'd like to call the seriousness project, right? Which is that Labour is a serious party who will be competent, and
I think you're absolutely right there, and he's just playing that card.
Yeah. My worries about it are, well, worries on the part of a Labour perspective, and would be that, number one, this lasts for as long as Boris Johnson is in government and screwing up. It's not an absolute certainty he stays there forever, although he's 5 to 6 to reach the next election. Now that's changing bottled on, so maybe you know, they fancy the chance of that. And secondly, is that something which will energize people in the way that other successful parties have in the past? I'm not terribly sure. I just think we don't really know. It was interesting because on Politics Live today, Simon Child wrote something about how Labour will be in trouble without an energised left. I think this was for a general election down the line, but it is something interesting to think about. But I see why Labour are going with the cost of living crisis angle. There's definitely some sort of hay to be made. It's just in general, and this is something I've noticed they struggle with a bit, all well and good attacking the government for a cost of living crisis, but as you said, what is the Labour offer to it? And in some cases, some people have already said it's rather paltry. For example, I believe there was the VAT on fuel bills gesture, which in the end, in real terms, didn't end up taking much. I think it ended up taking about as much off a bill in theory as Sunak's 5p fuel duty cut ended up taking out of a full tank of petrol, which is like £3 for 90 quid or something. You know, Labour could get asked, what do you have to offer on this question? And the answer might not be very good.
Well, I often find opposition pathetic at times like this, and the same in Ireland, where they just criticise the government, which is kind of like the government is essentially trying to, you know, stop the tide with a pitchfork here. I mean, there's nothing you can do really about like the global trend in this, to my mind anyway. But Neil, what did you make of our man Rishi's spring statement as well?
Well, I mean, obviously, from my point of view, I think the spring statement was ridiculously depressing. I mean, it was so obvious that he's got this fiscal headway. He might hate the OBR, but they've told him that he's got a lot of money up his sleeve,
which he's saving for the next election.
Yeah, he's also got a great situation from that point of view. In the inflation means that people, although most people are getting real-time cuts in their wages, they are actually getting wage rises. So people getting sort of 5% wage rises against 8% inflation. And if you keep the thresholds the same, or they haven't gone up by the same amount, it actually means that you get massively increased tax revenue. So he's had hugely increased tax revenue in the last few months because of the inflation. And he could have spent that, obviously, and he could have chosen to spend it in a progressive way, and he hasn't really. So he didn't, obviously he hasn't increased people's benefits above inflation, and generally, a lot of public sector workers are getting effectively a 5% pay cut. But putting that aside, just in terms of the politics and the way it's affected the betting, it was kind of interesting because I noticed Paul, who's absent this week, wrote something about how Rishi's on the slide now, and his star is waning and all that kind of thing, which is, I love Paul, but he does do that a little bit, talks his own book. He'd obviously bet against him, and now
he's not here to answer back, of course.
I don't want to slag him off while he's not here. I wasn't doing that, Paul, if you're watching. But I just thought it was quite funny because like the day after the spring statement, Rishi Sunak was 3-1 to be the next Tory leader, which hadn't really moved, despite Paul's best efforts to write about how terrible he was doing. It didn't really move at all. And it wasn't really until 2 days after that it started to move. And I did just check a second ago to see what price he was.
Star Sport, the next Tory leader.
He's on the exchanges now. He's just, it's a little bit of a thin market, but he's around about 4-1 now, which is way the biggest price he's been. And it's quite funny, actually, because in terms of the polling, talking about Labour as well, it hasn't really changed. The spring statement was widely regarded to be a bit of a disaster, but it was very much considered to be Rishi Sunak's disaster and not really the Tories' disaster, which is kind of amusing, really, because the two should be sort of intrinsically linked. The other thing is that there was a wide perception a few weeks ago. The problem that Labour had was that they were going on competency against this, bit of a clown prime minister. But when they were faced against maybe Rishi, the Superman, they would struggle a bit more. Well, now, the fortunes of Rishi and Boris Johnson are intrinsically linked. If the worse that Rishi does, the more chance that Boris stays. And the people in the ERG who are perhaps supporting Rishi and the kind of hard right of the Tory party, the fiscal hawks, they probably think that this is, they may say to you, well, with this war in Ukraine, it's not a good time to be changing leader. But really, I think what they're thinking is, Rishi's stock is not at its absolute peak at the moment. So this is not a good time to have a leadership election because he might not win.
Well, if you had a less polarizing figure as Jeremy Corbyn was in the last election, and you had a Labour Party that was fairly, knew what it was doing on Brexit, whichever way that was. I guess my point is, what do Labour actually stand for now if you're a left-wing voter? And why would you be compelled to vote for Labour apart from not wanting to vote for the Conservatives? Well, like, because he does. I don't know. I'm left-wing, but I don't know if I were in Britain, why would I vote Labour?
Well, I don't know. You tell me. I haven't decided. I mean, I'm a member of the party, and I can barely find a reason to vote for them. They don't really offer anything, but if they're going to offer competency, well, first of all, I don't really buy that anyway. The party's going bankrupt. I don't think they've got any really great media performers on the front bench, and a lot of them haven't got any ministerial experience. So I don't really see. They're basically keeping silent and hoping that the other guy messes up. It's quite a good strategy, but eventually you have to come up with something. One of the big criticisms of the 2019 election, because obviously the right of the Labour Party didn't want to admit that any of the problem in losing the election was down to the fact that a lot of people on the doorstep just said to you betrayed us on Brexit, you're going against my vote. That was actually a major reason why Labour lost the last election. Clearly, the unpopularity of Jeremy Corbyn was another factor. But the Labour right will tell you that the main factor was that the manifesto was too left-wing and there were too many policies in it. I don't think that's really true.
How is there a Labour right? Like, just explain, how do you have a political system where Labour right can be said one word after the other?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely correct. But I mean, the Labour Party isn't really a left-wing party. And for much of its history, it hasn't been a left-wing party. I mean, in my lifetime, you know, the Labour leaders, Harold Wilson, Jim Callaghan, Michael Foot, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Ed Miliband. You know, the left-wing ones are Michael Foot, Ed Miliband, and Jeremy Corbyn. And, you know, Ed Miliband probably, you know, was really a centrist politician. The Overton window in politics has moved so far to the right that Ed Miliband is considered to be left wing. But quickly on the Rishi Boris, the way that they're intrinsically connected, I was going to say on that, because it's funny, every time Rishi drifts in the next leader market, the price on Boris Johnson surviving till 224 or later contracts. And, you know, I do follow that market quite a lot. And on the exchanges, in the 18 boxes that you can see, you very rarely see a large lump of money. So I'm looking at it right now. The biggest amount in any of the 18 boxes is £235. A couple of weeks ago, somebody put up 20 grand in one hit trying to bet Boris Johnson to go in 2022. And what normally happens when somebody puts up a huge amount like that is there's a whole bunch of people go in front of them because they think that's the way the market's moving. And a bigger chunk of money turned up this week, actually. And this was somebody trying to lay that he would go in 2022. So to bet that he would last until at least 2023. And they tried to put up 3,500 at 3.45. So the market's, and that's caused him to drift to go in 2022. He's 3.6, 3.85 now. So that's the biggest price he's been. And I do think, you know, I thought the party was quite interesting. I don't know whether you saw any of the coverage of that. When the MPs were arriving at the party, I mean, it's not the best hotel in the world. I mean, I'm not knocking it. I'm sure it's very nice. But I mean, you know, you're an MP, you're earning 80,000 a year. You can claim 200,000 in expenses. You've got some nice limited companies with PPE contracts. You employ your missus on 50 grand a year to be your assistant. You've got a house in London and another house in the constituency. I mean, how much are you really swayed by the opportunity to go and hang out with a bunch of old duffers in a hotel in London, have a couple of glasses of champagne and a bit of a boogie? But some of those Tory backbenchers seemed absolutely delighted to be invited to a party with Boris Johnson, ironically going to a party on the day that 20 people got their fixed penalty notice. But I did think, looking at that, I just can't see where 54 letters are going to come from. They absolutely seem to love him still.
William, come in on that as well. It does, I don't know, the longer it drags on, the more skittish you are if you have back to 2022.
Yeah, I think that dream's disappearing pretty fast at the moment. There is one point of danger, which is local elections. But as we have discussed, the framing for those is very different to, you know, sort of a national election. It is not as simple as sort of winner loser, and quantifying what's a good, bad, or average night is tricky. So he's now 11-4. By the way, we should probably look over the exit date odds whilst we're here.
But look at talking about how the local elections can affect that. I mean, you know, we're on the 4-year cycle. So 4 years ago, these particular local elections were being fought under a Theresa May, Jeremy Corbyn situation. And the Labour right and the press afterwards were saying what a disaster it was for Corbyn. Now Keir Starmer's briefing and saying that 4 years ago, Theresa May was at her nadir and it's going to be really difficult
for
Labour to have a good night, because the Tories are bound to bounce back from that. What the Tories will be saying is that we're 12 years into the electoral cycle. This government's been around a long time, and local elections are a perfect chance to give them a kicking. Well, actually, I mean, in London, you've only really got 4 councils that can change hands, Barnet and Wandsworth probably being the main 2. And most likely what's going to happen is 2 of them are going to remain Tory, and either 1 or 2 of them are going to flip to Labour. So it'll either go 3-1 Tory or 4-0 Tory, or possibly 2-all. Well, I don't really see how that's going to be portrayed as a massive victory for either side. It's certainly not going to be enough to make Boris Johnson think about resigning, or for the 54 letters to come in. I mean, I appreciate that elections are not just in London. There's plenty of stuff happening in the West Midlands and a little bit up in the Northeast as well. But there's no like big mayoral elections or anything. It's just not big enough, these local elections, to make the Prime Minister resign or get kicked out. Sorry, Will, I know I interrupted you there. Go on, you carry on.
Well, actually, you've made a really good point now. And the wider point I was going to say is it will be incredibly difficult to spin that into could you look at that, he's got to go situation. And as such, you might feel that the last big point of danger has gone. So sort of just to run off quickly, he's 11-4 to go this year, which we're all presumably thinking will take something extraordinary to. He's 5-2 to go next year. And he's 5-6 to go in 2024 or later. And he's also now 5-6 each of 2 to lead the Tories into the next election or not, which is a really interesting, I think it's a really interesting thinking exercise, right? Because I've been of the opinion, and I might still be actually, that if they go into the next election with him, they give Keir Starmer the best possible chance, give Keir the best possible chance.
He's 4-1, William, which I still think, if you're playing the long game, but at the same time, if you were, I got to ask you, William, if you're on either of the 5-6s, surely, you know, the rebels at that stage come up with some reason to get rid of him before then.
Yeah, you'd think they wouldn't want to make their move too close to a hypothetical election. Well, that could now be, I think it can be 2025 following abolition of the fixed term parliament tax. So it just depends on what happens through the rest of the year and beyond. And, you know, it's very difficult to predict that. We know it's going to be a cost of living crisis. We know it's going to be sustained, but that happening and people blaming the government for it in a way that hurts them electorally, it's difficult. There's plenty of things that I would think should have taken any government down that haven't taken this government down with the Prime Minister. So long story short, I think if you oppose Johnson going this year, or you back to different year date, you're sitting very pretty.
Last word to you, Neil. You have about a minute.
Oh God! Well, I don't need a minute. To be honest, I think he's still way too short to go this year. I've been fiddling around laying that, but now the biggest confusion to me is whether they get rid of him next year on the basis that he's not. You know, they didn't find a good enough reason to get rid of him this year. Actually, I never really understand this argument that, you know, well, we've got this guy who's a complete idiot. He's a liar. You can't trust him. He can't, he's got no concentration span. He doesn't read the briefing notes, blah, blah, blah. But there's a war on, so we can't get rid of him. Like, surely if there's a war on, and your argument is that this is such an important time, well, surely you want somebody that's a bit competent in. But I don't know. I mean, think about Scotland. I mean, the Tories are not really doing very well in Scotland, but pretty much all of those Scottish Tory MPs came out openly and said that they sent a letter in. You're telling me they're now going to have to go into a general election fighting against an SNP who just seem relentlessly to march on, standing on the doorstep and saying, vote for me to help Boris Johnson be the Prime Minister, even though just 2 years ago I said that he was totally incompetent and had to go. It just seems mad to me, but I do wonder whether there's really, this 3-1 about him, is that too big a gap? He's evens to last, or slight odds on to last until 2024, and he's more like 3-1 to go in 2023. Is that too big a gap? Will the Tories think, well, the war's died down a bit now, that's not such a big thing, the cost of living crisis is easing because inflation is going to come down next year, and we've got the fiscal headway that the OBR have told us about, growth recovers very slightly.
We do have to wrap up.
Are they going to think that's the time to get Rishi back in?
And that is the question. I did make the point before, Boris, his peak of popularity was when he had COVID and he was managing a ridiculously bad crisis, which I could never really get my head around. That was the polling station. We'll be back next week.